By means of introduction, I'm not sure you actually need much introduction, but Richard operates, that's the wrong word, but works on the MA and the BA programs at King's College, but also works on various programs with International House. And there's a link to Danny, who is a teacher trainer to International House in London as well. But they have more in common than that, because they co-authored a book you may have heard of, which is Working with Emergent Language, and that's very much the topic of today's plenary. So creating an emergent language culture in a teaching team. Well, over to you, Danny. Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
Well, it's a real pleasure for us to be here this afternoon with you, and thank you for tuning in from all of the various countries that you all said hello from in the chat box. As I said, my name is R.Chinn, and
I'm D.Norrington-Davies. Hello, thank you for coming.
And today our talk, as Alex said, is creating an emergent language culture in a teaching team. And we're going to explore that in our particular context in the staff room and the place where we work at International House London today. So to get us started, we need to think about two key concepts to clarify first of all. First of all, what do we mean by emergent language? This might be a new term for people. And secondly, what do we mean by culture? Well, let's start with this term emergent language first. So the term emergent language originates in Dogma ELT, or Teaching Unplugged. It came out, it was first used in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when Dogma was being talked about. And the idea is that it's about focusing on reactive teaching, about moments in class that arise when the teacher deals with unplanned language. This is the definition that Danny and I came up with when we came to write our book. And it's unplanned language that's needed or produced by learners in meaning-focused interactions. This language is then explored through reformulation by the teacher, clarification, and support in general from the teacher to help the learners say what they want to say. Now, that language could come from the teacher noticing a gap in the learner's knowledge and wanting to challenge the learners, or it could come from the learners asking the teacher for support in order to scaffold their output and get their ideas across. But the idea is that it comes out of dialogue in class, out of meaningful interaction. There's a moment where intervention from the teachers can happen, where we work to support learners with their language needs. And that's what we mean by emergent language. The second term we're looking at today, to clarify this before we move on, is what do we mean by culture? Now, we could be here till next Christmas defining what we mean by culture, because culture is notoriously difficult to define. In this talk today, what we're going to be focusing on is part of Matsumoto's definition of culture, and we're going to be focusing on the set of attitudes, values, and beliefs shared by a particular group of people. So that's our definition that we'll be working with to contextualize the session today. So what do we mean by culture in this talk today? Well, it's a culture in the workplace that focuses on values and beliefs. And we're going to explore the culture in our particular place of work that grew quite naturally out of an interest in the topic of emergent language. But we'll give that some context. But the key thing to think about is that a culture grows through sharing stories, sharing experiences, sharing our beliefs, and sharing our discoveries that we make from investigation into our practice as teachers in the classroom.
Okay, so the session outline for you, we're going to provide examples of how the sort of emergent language culture grew at International House London, and we'll share two particular examples. We'll explore how you can create a culture that's conducive to collaboration and sharing good practice, and something that allows the culture to grow. As I said, we're going to give you an example of two CPD projects and how they emerged in the school. And we're going to look at how these led to teacher development and helped develop a culture of sharing attitudes and values and stories and beliefs. So it's a sort of, there's a cycle happening here, as well as just two projects. But also, we're going to look at how anyone in the culture can contribute to it. So we're going to be talking about work we did with teachers as kind of, I don't know, what's our roles, sort of senior
Catalysts,
teachers. Well, we're calling ourselves catalysts in the talk, but in International House, I guess we're sort of senior teachers with a sort of role in training. But we're also going to look at how teachers themselves, managers, even schools can contribute to the cultures we talk about, or the culture we are talking about today. Just a little bit of background. I was shocked talking to Ben Beaumont yesterday to something I've been at International House now for 18 years, I think, 17, 18 years. When I got there, the sort of early teacher development in International House was a bit like the image of Shibuya Crossing there, where everyone's just sort of off doing their own thing, often attending and delivering in-house teacher development sessions. We had invited speakers or experts coming in to talk to us. Teachers came and observed us, and we got feedback that way. We did have something called open door classrooms, which sounds like a really good idea. What this was is that you basically said, my door is open, and anyone could come and watch you. But when I was a newer teacher at the school, people would come and watch, and then they'd say, oh, that was lovely, thank you. What a lovely manner. And you're kind of like, well, that's nice. Everyone thinks I'm nice.
Well done.
Well done. Yeah. Even though it's a lovely idea, but it wasn't really doing much for me. And I think this is often the implication of quite traditional teacher development in schools. The sense that teacher development was top down. I was delivering input sessions because I thought it would look good and maybe get me the CELTA job or the Delta job. You got lunch vouchers for attending. There was very much a one-size-fits-all view of teacher development.
Product, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. But actually, the sort of series of projects that I'll show you on the next bullet point, there was never really any follow-up or evaluation of the input. So I'd learn something about, say, motivation, and then I'd do some motivating stuff. But we never talked about how it worked. You might talk about it with another teacher, but nothing was really evaluated. There was way too much content. And actually, the little mind map on the side was the sessions that I remember. There's visualization, inner voice, transposition, just so much content. And I think there was not really any overarching theme to my development. There were things that interested me and I'll give that a go, but no real themes. But saying that, here's a picture of Melissa Lamb, who told me her title yesterday.
Teacher Development Manager.
I think it's not manager. Coordinator? Manager. Yeah. Development Manager. But amazing person, an amazing role. So when we started being involved in this emergent language culture, or being catalyst for this emergent language culture, Mel, since she became teacher training manager, has changed the practices. So with discussions and reading groups, organising critical friends in the team so that teachers can collaborate, teacher development sessions being joined up and lasting over periods of time, and often followed up with blogs or write-ups, but really putting teachers in charge of their own development. So I think we're talking about setting up, whether we set it up or not, being part of a culture emerging in a very, very sort of rich environment. So that is something we have to consider.
So what's related to this is that this has created a general culture of curiosity and inquiry in the school, which I think has been very successful in terms of teacher development. And we've been, I work at the university most of the time, so it's great coming in and seeing what's happening in the staff room, where people are genuinely interested in what each other are doing in class. And this focus of inquiry, about 3 years ago, moved towards a focus on emergent language. And there might be a few reasons for this. One of them is that Danny and I were writing the book and there was lots of talk about it. But also the context in International House London is one where there's a very conversationally driven approach that happens alongside materials. So emergent language is something that has always been talked about, but I think it was talked about more at this point. So what happened next? Well, we were waiting for our book to be published. And this section, we're going to talk about how teachers engaged in some investigation. And as we were waiting for our book to be published, me and Danny were chatting, and I thought it'd be really interesting to see what some more of the teachers think of the activities that we've created to help teachers work with emergent language. So in a way, I think, we acted as a catalyst, or I did. I sent out an email asking if anyone would be interested in trying out the activities. We'd already got testimonials and commentaries that we'd developed from teachers trialing the activities, but we wanted to see a bit more what people were doing. And there, as I say, there seemed to be a genuine interest in the staff room in emergent language. So I sent out, would anyone like to try? So I invited the teachers to try some tasks, and I had only 2 respondents, which is not unusual because teachers are very busy people. There's not a lot of time to do other things, but it was really nice that Alex on the left here, who'd been teaching for 5 years in China and had an MA in Applied Linguistics and ELT from King's, and after that did his CELTA with Danny at IH London, and Marianne, who had 20 years experience of teaching the British Council, I think, in Italy, and then had been at IH London for a couple of years and recently finished her Delta. So they were teachers with some experience and a lot of experience in Marianne's case. So I offered them some self-directed reflection tasks to try out. And one of the tasks that they picked that they wanted to look at was a task, they chose a few tasks, but one of them was focused on critical incidents. And what I mean by critical incident, and Danny and I define it as this in our book, are unplanned events in class that arise that the teacher sees as interesting or perhaps challenging. Not always negative though, but something that's interesting. And emergent language moments in class are always critical incidents because they're unplanned in this way. So they decided to explore a critical incident in class. And to do that, they use these questions. And I'll shut up for a moment and let you read the questions. I won't read them out for you. Okay, so as you can see, these are general guiding questions to help you explore a critical incident in class. So it was very interesting. Alex and Marianne got together and they discussed what their beliefs and feelings were about emergent language related to some other tasks. And with this task, they found that they brought their examples of emergent language from class together. And when they got together, they set goals about things that they'd like to try based on what they'd noticed about their practice. Then they went and experimented in class. They came back and they shared, and then they reflected. And this was an iterative cycle, which is really interesting because actually what they're doing is a form of exploratory practice, or we could say a type of action research, where they had shared goals that they wanted to discover elements about their practice regarding emergent language. What was really interesting was they were doing this in the staff room. It's an open plan staff room at IH London. And some of the novice teachers, the newer teachers, started to become interested in what they were saying. It's like, what's that? Okay, and getting involved in the conversation. And this kind of snowballed quite organically and naturally. And then as a result, Alex and Marianne organised some teachers' meetings because there was generally a shared interest among the staff. And they had about 10 or 12 teachers that attended their first meeting and their subsequent meetings. So they went to the meetings and they used the task that I'd given them. We've seen an example of the critical incident one. And it was very interesting what happened. So what happened is Alex and Marianne got the group together. They talked through different critical incidents for different people in the group, more novice teachers. And here's an example of the kind of things that happened in response to this. So first of all, they prompted the teacher to look at what the interaction was in class, what was happening in class. Here's an example, student-initiated term. What is it called when a UFO falls from the sky? I don't know about you, Danny, but I'd find that pretty difficult to answer. But what the teacher did do is to seize upon this as a moment to teach a set of multi-word verbs through drawings and explanation. And in a way, what the teacher is doing, this is something that we've discovered, the teacher's kind of packaging this up for the learners in this particular incident.
So it's kind of worth, as you're watching this session, to remember this instance, because we saw it happening on a few occasions. And Marianne has gone on to talk about this quite a lot in the interesting work she's done. And this idea of packaging we'll come back to a bit later.
And absolutely, because emergent language moments are various, because it can be student initiated in this case, but the teacher's taken charge of teaching these. Now, what they did was interesting. So digging a little bit deeper. So this is the interaction. This is what happened. And obviously, the next thing we'd like to find out is, what's your rationale? Why did you do this? And the teacher said, well, similar physical properties to fall. They were lower level learner students, so I didn't want to overwhelm them with too many multi-word verbs, but I thought it would be useful to teach them here. So this is the kind of discussions that they have. We don't have time today to look at lots of examples, but you can see this is the process that you're getting the teachers to look for evidence of what happened in class. What were the facts of what happened in class? Now, this is interesting because actually, when we explore a critical incident, as I say, it's about looking at evidence. We can see what teachers really do as opposed to what teachers say they do. There are lots of reasons why we might want to say what we think we should say in front of a group, but actually what we really do might be different. But if you explore using a critical incident, then we're making that much more evidence-based.
Especially when a mentor manager isn't there or stimulating this discussion in a kind of top-down development session where you're thinking, I better say I did this type of thing.
Absolutely. And I think, and with the group, I think, because it wasn't, me and Danny didn't go to any of these meetings. We kept well out of the way and just let them get on with it. And I think that's the way it should be, because it was very bottom up and teacher driven in this way. So they could be more honest with each other, as we'll see in a few moments. There were common themes that came up that you would imagine, for example, when should I intervene in class? Should it be on the spot? Should it be delayed? The typical things that come up. Also, it could be to do with, for example, should I focus on accuracy or fluency? When do I intervene? Back to this first point. So there were about 20 points that came up, but we'll look at just those ones today. One common shared understanding really stood out, and this is when Marianne and Alex came back to me and asked for a bit of support and help, because they said the teachers were saying it's about the vibe, the vibe in the room. You're not always making conscious decisions. It depends on how your brain ticks. And they got a bit stuck with this because, as you were probably thinking, looking at this, what the hell is the vibe? What's beyond the vibe? What's underneath it? What's motivating the vibe? So it's very superficial, this idea of the vibe, but it is an initial shared understanding that the teachers have. So Alex and Marianne went back after our discussion, and I said, I think you need to go and dig a bit deeper. And they did. They did dig a bit deeper. They did dig a bit deeper. So when they came back, what was really interesting, the things that Danny and I hadn't come across before, but and had not heard teachers say openly before, but it was about the teacher as a person. It was about what motivates the teacher to deal with certain language, as opposed to responding to the learners, which is obviously the perspective that we had been looking at it from the beginning. What's motivating the teacher? What are the teacher's feelings about the topic, and whether they're going to deal with it? And also, does the teacher feel confident to deal with the language? An example of this is, we had a nice example. One guy, a newer teacher, sport had come up in class, and he said, well, I don't know anything about it. And I felt really uncomfortable talking about it. So, if it's music, I feel like I'm much more useful in this situation. I've got more language I can support the teachers with. So I think it was a really interesting conversation to have, because lots of these hidden worries or fears or inadequacies we might be experiencing as teachers, and when we're forming our identity as teachers, certainly when we're newer teachers, I think this is quite interesting, an interesting thing to emerge. It's quite normal that teachers at an early stage in their career might be feeling this, because there's a focus on yourself. It's difficult to focus on the learners because there's a lack of attentional resources to focus on the learners. And there's a lack of ability to anticipate and react to what's happening in the room. And obviously, if we want to deal with emergent language completely effectively, then we've got to be able to react. That does come with experience, but how do we speed that process up? Helping these teachers move beyond a cognitive stage in their development can be dealt with through awareness raising of this kind, through sharing experiences. Suddenly they become more aware of what other possibilities and choices there are available to them. So we can support teacher development in this way. And back to the idea of a culture of sharing, a culture of exploring and looking for what we're curious in and finding answers to that can help build this culture.
And there's that sort of idea that they've developed this shared language, talking about the vibe. That's what was understood by them. And we had to come in and learn what they meant by a vibe, because they've kind of created this little cultural group that has a sort of language to describe feelings, identity, that sort of thing.
And then it let us go, we were able to go beneath the surface and deeper into that as a result. So how do you get teachers like this involved in a culture? Well, get the teachers talking about what they do in class. Learning, we can think of it as a dialogic process where we co-construct meaning and new understandings emerge through this kind of professional development and learning. This shared understanding that Danny mentioned before. And this is very much based on the work of Manor Walsh and evidence-based reflective practice. And this kind of dialogue, getting people talking, it helps sustain a culture of sharing, teacher curiosity. Interestingly, a stage above this in the kind of meta level, Alex and Marianne had their own reflections about what they learned from the whole process. And I'd like to share those with you now very briefly. But they felt that sharing concerns with each other really helped them feel that they weren't alone in class experiencing something on their own. There was a sense of relief knowing that someone else is experiencing something I find difficult or I'm puzzled about in class. And Alex, a newest, 5 years into his teaching, felt that he got a real confidence boost from this working in this way. And they were encouraging each other through this, and they felt part of a professional group, which was really important to them. This idea of sharing goals added to that. Marianne, who'd been teaching for 20 years, felt that she had sort of reinvigorated her practice, and it renewed motivation in investigating her teaching. I think this is a lesson we can learn for managers certainly can learn when you've got teachers who've been teaching for years. How do we get them reinterested in what they're doing in class when they might be quite happy where they're at, but could still learn more? Alex and Marianne went on to organise other teacher development sessions that were not to do with emergent language, but not close to it, where they encouraged teachers to form critical pair groups. That's critical as in important, as opposed to critical as in you're rubbish. And what happened next? So following this, Alex subsequently moved off to work in ESOL in London, and Marianne teamed up with another post-Delta teacher, Anna, and they were puzzled about whose agenda was driving the emergent language, a bit linked to what we were talking about earlier on, and what frameworks would support emergent language. They planned an experiment where they looked at a shallow-end task-based lesson. I think it was task, teach, task, versus a deep-end TBL lesson in the traditional sense, and a dogma lesson where it was completely conversation-driven. And what they found is that actually we'd expect the dogma lesson to be much more emergent language rich. They all had emergent language, but Marianne felt in the dogma lesson that actually she was controlling the language because she felt like there was a lack of direction in the lesson. So she felt like she had to give it direction by controlling the language more. Whereas with the shallow end task-based lesson, you'd expect it to be more focused on more target language we want them to learn, and functional language and whatnot. Actually, what she found is that the focus of the task acted as a filter, and she was able to then work with the learner's emergent language need as and when. They gathered data from their classes and individually reflected. They reflected together, they drew conclusions, and then Marianne presented their ideas at IATEFL, and then they both together ran a workshop recently at IH London, which was well attended by other members of the teaching team. So just to summarize this section, in order to develop a culture in your school of this kind of sharing and inquiry, emergent language in our case, it's really about demystifying, first of all, what happens in other teachers' classrooms. Sometimes you think, in Danny's class, they're all rolling in the aisles and having a great time. Why are they so quiet in my class? So it's demystifying about what's happening. Actually, probably what's happening in your class is not so dissimilar to what's happening in mine. It's about teacher-driven investigation, exploring this emergent teacher identity for newer teachers, and even as experienced teachers, exploring our identity and how we see ourselves as teachers, as we saw with the focus of what was driving emergent language. But it is about bringing to the surface what's hidden, what's the iceberg analogy, what's under the water. And it's really about encouraging independent communities of practice where sharing is allowed and expected, these little working groups where we encourage this kind of sharing and experimentation.
So that was sort of the first project. Richard just really providing a spark, acting as a kind of catalyst, the teachers really, really running with it and building and developing this culture with these shared goals, shared experience, shared beliefs, shared understandings, shared language. So, already this environment exists. And here is the second catalyst, what we call the Dogme Development Project. And it really just came from a little spark. I received an email or saw it on LinkedIn or something of Luke Meddings and Scott Thornbury announcing their new project, a new book that encourages teachers to send in reflections about their experiences with Dogme. So we just said in a staff meeting, if anyone's interested in putting in a example, just get in touch and we'll support you. And we had a lot of interested teachers. So here we have the catalyst coming in. Sorry, I can see there's 43 comments in chat and 6 in more. We'll hopefully have time for questions at the end. Well, we will have time for questions at the end. Shouldn't have promised. But so yeah, we're kind of working as catalysts right at the beginning, but we kind of have to. We thought, me and Mel in this case, would be good to sort of have something for teachers to work with. So we set up a meeting where we gave them a set of questions. Just who were you teaching, what happened, and what opportunities emerged. So the teachers just went off, and if they wanted to experiment with Dogme or reflect on an emergent language experience, they could, but they had a set of questions in their heads while they did so. But then we set up a couple of meetings. So I had a meeting with 5 of the teachers and Mel with 7, just because we were free at different times. In these meetings, the catalysts presented posters depicting their stories. So me and Mel, basically, in our classes, we did exactly the same thing. We made our own posters. And the teachers made their own posters. And then the teachers shared their stories. And then we had follow-on discussions, and whatever came out of those discussions, we would see. So here's my example. You can see that's my poster on the right. This was me reflecting on a class. I think it probably was from February this year. It was a B1, B2 group. The lesson was on must-see films for 2024. So all it was 10 posters of films, and lots of tasks based around it. Basically, the students would have to decide what trailer to watch, etc., etc., etc. But at one point, we were talking about genres, film genres, and I had a student from France who, in the middle of this discussion, said, "How are you pronouncing genre?" And I said, "Oh, why?" And she told me that, in French, it's genre, and I'm saying genre. She's saying, "Why are you doing that?" And really, we had a discussion then on pronouncing French words in English. with an accent, and the zombie films are my favourite genre. It doesn't really sound right. And I was saying, sometimes when people might put on a French accent when they're describing a French thing, you often sound a bit sort of not arrogant, sort of being overly sophisticated type thing, and there's kind of pretentious maybe. Yes, so that's really, really interesting. So it's this small moment I reflected on, but what it did was maybe think, how often do I have conversations about the students classes? And I actually think I do it quite a lot. We were talking about translanguaging adjacent critical incidents, if such a thing can occur. That was my poster. That's what I said. It was just, oh my God, that was an interesting discussion, just initiated by a learner going off-piste in the lesson. Going off-piste in the lesson. Right. So here's a teacher's example. One of the teachers who came to the session working with an advanced class, an off-piste discussion about induction hobs, how this happened.
When would you ever talk about induction? You'd never find it in a course book, or quite likely not, but in this class it came up.
Air fryers, you would.
It's a new one. Yeah.
Someone's writing right now. The discussion about induction hobs came up, and the teacher was kind of happy that they'd let this, they hadn't shut it down, they'd let the discussion be extended. But what their reflection was, and it goes back to what Richard was saying about packaging. It's very, very similar to this UFO incident and this idea of teacher agenda. The teacher felt that they should have reflected and capitalized more on the moment. And I don't know whether that would be teaching other types of hobs or a set of collocations with other but C1, C2, but this sort of feeling of wanting to package up the language somehow. They hadn't felt it was a particularly good ending to this lovely discussion about induction hobs. And I'll come back to what emerged from that later on. There was a sort of strategic intervention that came up later on. We both know Luke Reddings, fortunately, so I told him about these meetings and how fascinating they were and said, would you like to come and hear about them? So he said, yeah, I'll come in. And Luke just came in and he listened to the teachers' stories and looked at their posters, very ELT theme scene there. He then did a follow-on Q&A where they asked him questions. So he came with nothing, very dogmatic, putting his money where his mouth is really. And then we all had a discussion on what we might do next. And he said, come on, if you want to submit, go for it. These sound great. And actually we got 5 submissions. So it's gone from this staff announcement to 5 teachers submitting something to a book. That's not the goal we set out with, about having, that's a successful number, but that's lovely to see that the teachers got so far into this process. But here are the sorts of new understandings and came from it. The teachers, firstly, all felt quite confident about dogma. Said, yeah, we get this, we know what this is. But coming together helped them see that. They all talked about having greater trust with emergent language through the experience. And part of it was because of the response from learners. And I think it was Gabrielle, and I wrote down their names. So Gabriella and Teresa in a talk earlier were talking about getting feedback from students. Here it's just happening. Students are part of this culture, of course, or the culture develops through the context, which I think, again, was something that Teresa was talking about, and Susan in the talk we saw just before this one. They were becoming more confident in their ability to be creative and spontaneous. But this was the nice one that came out of the poster I showed you just now about the induction hobs. But they came to the idea that emergent language moments can just be moments. There's a moment where a discussion develops, they have it, and they move on. You don't have to package it up.
Or it could be when scaffolding happens, and the teacher's helping by giving the learner a word or a phrase or something they need in order to carry on, then you get out of the way, and it's the moment passes.
So it might just be, oh, you mean induction hobs? That's it. you've done it. It's the pragmatic, it's the learner need being solved. And I love this. Emergent language moments can just be moments. But then they had so many emergent questions that it's just going to keep feeding this culture. Yes, the first one is, how do we package up EL? How do we go to more the sort of fall out, fall off, fall in type stuff? But how do you, I can't read what that says because how do you something naturally occurring? I think that's recycle. How do you recycle naturally emerging language? And how do you make learning more visible? So these are the sort of shared goals that these teachers have come up with. Is it still me? Yeah. Yes, lovely, good. Right. So what's in it for teachers? Okay, well, firstly, it's you're making sense of learning opportunities, and this is a big part of teacher learning. So, you often, as I showed you earlier when we were doing sort of the early TD, weren't really making sense of the learning opportunities we were given because perhaps they weren't really learning opportunities, but being part of the process was so important for these teachers. And this process involves collaborative and participatory activities. So they're sharing similar experiences and ideas, and these are informing their practice. Right. Okay. I've forgotten who's doing what. Yeah, it's still me. You keep telling me.
You keep going.
Okay. So, searching for sparks. I think we now all feel, me, Richard and Mel and other people, you've got to follow the impulse to capitalize on situations that have the potential to generate new knowledge. And sometimes that just comes from earwigging on teachers' conversations, thinking, oh, they're really into this. How can I help? Or do I even need to help? You've got to then give them space to take action on the questions and on the actions. And that's what Marianne and Alex did, but then they were bringing other people in as well. But also you're kind of exploring the uniqueness and the individuality of their curiosity and interest. And actually some of the things that came out of the posters were really interesting. A teacher talking about identity as someone learning their heritage language at the same time as teaching English. They found that a lot of their emergent language moments were kind of quite related to their feelings about learning the heritage language. But we've got to think about our own role within the culture. And of course, we can set tasks and questions to get people started because, as Borg says, a lot of teachers won't engage in or more likely sustain research without support from some kind of mentor. So we've got to kind of keep checking the fire hasn't gone out. But we can't expect goals or outcomes. Had there been no proposals to the book, wouldn't have mattered at all. Really happy there's 5. 1 would have been lovely. None would have been fine. We just got to wait and see what happens. And we've got to do things that enable teachers to explore the learning process. So this idea of just inputting skills and techniques, this sort of carousel of that wasn't really working, but strategic interventions. Inviting Luke Meddings was a strategic intervention. It might be come and observe us, or let's set up a series of peer observations. So you might want to do that. But also finding ways for teachers to share and publish what they've done. So we've got the things like a blog. They're going to be doing it in the book, but also just sharing it by meeting together. Here's an example of the DIY development site, it's called. And it just says, check out our experiences, thanking the teachers who agreed to let their posters go up on the walls first and then into the blog. And it's a lovely way just to share, really. So a quick comeback to the idea of a culture. So it is a group of individuals with a shared interest in emerging. This you?
No, go for it.
Yeah. Okay. They've got shared goals and they've got a commitment to achieving the goals together. And they're not working alone. They share stories and experiences and beliefs and discoveries and outcomes. And all the time, actually, probably should have had beliefs as the last word, because the beliefs are always kind of being bolstered, changed, adapted and strengthened perhaps by the stories, by the experiences, by the discoveries, by the outcomes. and they develop a shared language to talk about things. And it's all happening in International House London within a general culture of this kind of teacher development.
So to get things going, you need a catalyst, you need that spark, as we've been talking about today. Some advice if you are in a position to be a catalyst. Maybe it can be anyone, it doesn't have to be the manager, it doesn't have to be a senior teacher, it can be another teacher in the organisation that's interested in something, someone within the culture. Listen to what the teachers are talking about and look for sparks, as Danny mentioned before, earwigging on conversations a little bit and see what's the zeitgeist in the staff room, what are people interested in. Encourage teachers to make critical friends and use tasks to stimulate discussion. Show teachers how to make reflection evidence-based as opposed to it being very general. Show teachers how to push beyond what they know, to explore their beliefs, explore what's behind what they think that they're doing. And, you know, it's a good idea to mix people up in terms of capability, have equally capable peers and more capable peers as
Of course,
well.
if they mix themselves up,
that's absolutely fine. Yeah. But one thing is to maybe encourage that, so it's not all the same people working together all the time, and create space for informal chats and organise times for teachers to meet and talk. This is the biggest challenge I think we've had, is getting everybody together, because everyone works at different times post-COVID in our organisation.
But that's kind of okay, because they're working within their little cultures.
And then we've got the sharing through using the blog as well.
For managers, and when we're saying managers here, we also mean if you're kind of head of a training team, or even working on something like a CELTA, you've got to understand what the shared goals are. If you don't know what their shared goals are, you're gonna maybe put a block on the impetus. You've got to speak the same language. You've got to know what they mean. We know what the vibe means. We know what packaging up means. Mariana uses the analogy of chips and mayo.
That's not even
I kind of know. I know what that means. You're not so sure, are you? There's this idea you scaffold the collaboration to keep the momentum up. So if you've made critical pairs on a CELTA, for example, or a Trinity TESOL, then you've got to kind of help the groups keep the momentum up, the pairs keep the momentum up, but also helping foster the culture of practice and research so that it feels valued and discussed and practiced and shared. And the DIY development blog, just sharing teacher stories and teacher outcomes all the time. They can see their success.
But the key thing is that it's never forced.
Never forced, yeah.
In terms of your institution, it's really important to think about how this impacts on the whole work environment, but the general quality of your staff room. I'll let you read the quote here by Gollum, Beck and Johnson. So the idea is that if you get this dialogue going in your staff room, it's going to have repercussions, a positive spin-off on the quality that happens within your institution as well. So it's a generally, I think someone was talking about, Lucy Shakespeare was talking about well-being earlier on. I think this can have a real positive effect on well-being, the general well-being in the staff room, of being a happy, positive place to work.
And feeling heard.
Absolutely. So just to finish off, creating a culture then, it's about the process, not the product, not these packaged up development sessions that stand alone and are not connected in any way. It's about the process of encouraging this kind of evidence-based teacher reflection to happen and the sharing to happen as well. So encourage communities of practice, and a culture can develop in this way. A positive culture can help an organisation thrive. And you do have to think about the fact that we need to create the conditions to help that culture grow. That's it from us today. If you're interested in the ideas that we've talked about from our book, Working with Emergent Language, there's a QR code here, and there's a discount code at the top, Chin24, and you can get, I think, 10% off. I think if you order it, you can also order it on Amazon as well.
And really, none of what we've been talking about today is in there. This has all moved on from since the book and kind of just before it came out. So there's a lot of, you could almost be writing more.
The next book.
Well, Richard, Danny?
We're nearly there now.
Got one thing to say. Here are the slides.
Thanks very much.
If you want, yeah, that's the link to the slides if you want them.
Perfect.
With the references as well on them. Sorry, Alex.
I'll stop interrupting you then for 3 seconds whilst people grab those slides. So we will be sharing the videos of these all presentations as well. So, well, firstly, Richard, Danny, thank you so much. Please tell me you guys are going to have a chat show. If you don't, you should have. So lots of questions. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm sure we can squeeze a couple of minutes in. So one thing, just from my perspective, and this is slightly going a little bit skew, but in what ways do you think engaging with emergent language gives kind of student agency? And what I mean by this is you're kind of giving time and attention to something that the students have accidentally contributed, and therefore it's kind of motivating for them what they may want to learn, even though they don't know they want to learn it. So in terms of that kind of ownership and agency, is it important in your opinion or not?
Absolutely, I think that's key. And Mike Chick earlier on in one of the pop-up sessions on the Coalition for Change was talking about reactive teaching. And one of the things he said, and I think this sums up what we talk about in the book a lot, is that language learning isn't simply just about packaging up, giving people a load of forms and then having to use them. It's actually looking at how they work in dialogue and also thinking about giving the learners a voice, choice and voice. So I think that's actually key. To why you should work with emergent language, Alex. Yeah, anything you'd like to add?
But also this stuff we've been seeing about packaging really links to agency, and it's something we hadn't kind of thought of before the book, and so it's interesting that the student just wants to know, they want to say something about UFOs. Yeah. By packaging it up, are you kind of taking the agency from them because you want to meet your teacher agenda,
start teaching with them,
teaching, or it's like, why do you want to know about? Have you seen it? She or she might really want to tell you about the UFO. They might have seen one, and this induction hob that's what the students want it to do. So it's really interesting. It's very much about agency, letting students have a voice. But we've got to kind of think about what do they really want from taking these opportunities. It's much, much bigger than we realised.
And this is one of the things that we explored was how do you get teachers to be more aware of the way that they're responding in class, and to broaden those, where are the learners' needs in here, and putting the learner first. Yeah. So I think that's certainly what's behind a lot of our work. Yeah. That agency, choice and voice.
Yeah,
very much about being that kind of student-centeredness, isn't it? Which we could look at in many ways. Loads of other questions. Let's see if we can get 2 more in. One that I liked, what aspects might make teachers feel insecure when they deal with emergent language, from Gabriella?
Oh, that's a chapter in the book, isn't it? Yeah, it's actually a chapter.
Buy the book, Gabriella.
But there are so many. There are so many. So it's some. And we've got lots of ways of solving this. Right at the beginning, it's very often not being able to hear it, not being able to separate the noise in the room from the noise in your own head and stuff like that. There's the sort of, when do I deal with it? What techniques do I use? This fear of interrupting the flow.
How do I deal with it?
Yeah. And also which items. So actually there's so many. So what we've suggested in the book, and I know this is coming across as a plug, but it's about sort of, firstly, really start recording your lessons as much as you can, or secretly recording the students, so you can really start listening to them in your own time, taking the recordings home and go, that's interesting, they said that. It's like learning to listen as a language learner. You've kind of got to attune yourself to the noise in the room first, and then start thinking, what would I do with that? What could I do with that? So it's very much about kind of putting on the swimming wings first and going in the shallow end before we think, right, I'm ready to.
I mean, the reason why, to answer your question, finish the question, is the reason why we got interested in this is because our Delta and CELTA trainees, often, we heard it in the staff room a lot, had these questions about their teaching. How do I don't feel, So these are the reasons why we started investigating it, because we felt we were giving quite a lot of advice on it in response to teachers, developing teachers' needs.
Yeah. If you are a trainer and if you observe teachers, note down when they work with emergent language, because they all do. Because students often don't know the word they want. And the teacher said, oh, you mean, or the moment where a teacher says, sorry, what do you mean? Those are moments where you work with emergent language. So some people think it's too big for me.
Yeah.
But actually
or it's not right to say that in that situation. It's better to say this. So all teachers do it, but it's amazing that it's been just kind of maybe just taken for granted, and it hasn't been explored very much in academic literature anyway, and certainly not for teacher education literature.
And I wonder if there's any pre-service training, and I'll be careful what I say here, that almost would encourage people, trainees, not to engage emergent language.
Yeah,
I imagine at your peril, because
I think you've got a very good point.
Because
you'll meet your aims. I think probably is the word, the phrase that stops it.
Why did you answer the learner's question when your target language was the present perfect?
You didn't mean that, did you? Anyway, no, exactly. Well, there are many other questions, and you've shared your emails kindly and the slides, and we all know what the book is. So I can only ask those attending, if you didn't get your questions answered, blame me. I'm sorry. Do send those through by email to Richard, Danny. Richard, Danny, thank you so much. Enjoyable, informative, good fun, and really took away a lot from that. So thank you so much for participating today.
For coming, everybody.
Thank you very much. Cheers. And do follow us on LinkedIn if you'd like to keep in touch with what we're doing.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much. So we are